Guyana stands at one of the most volatile security crossroads in its modern history, rocked by a bomb attack that pierced the nation's sense of safety, overwhelmed by rising street crimes, and increasingly exposed by porous borders, feeding illegal migration and weapons into our communities. At the same time, the Venezuelan border crisis looms large, and U.S. strikes against drug cartels in Caribbean waters have divided CARICOM. Few voices are better positioned to dissect these escalating threats than retired Rear Admiral and former Chief of Staff of the Guyana Defence Force, Dr. Gary Best. In this edition of Sources, Dr. Best delivers an unflinching assessment of the dangers confronting the nation and the decisive action required to defend it. Welcome to Sources. I'm your host, Svetlana Marshall. Tonight, we'll examine Guyana's escalating security challenges, from rising crime and border tensions to regional divisions. To do so with me, I have former Chief of Staff of the Guyana Defence Force, Rear Admiral retired Dr. Gary A.R. Best. Dr. Best, welcome to Sources.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Dr. Best, let's get right into it. Following the recent bomb attack at the gas station, many Guyanese are now feeling deeply insecure. From a national security and counterterrorism perspective, what immediate actions should the state be taking to deter copycats, attacks, and reassure the public?
Well, thank you for your question. It's a very interesting question. It's layered, and the answer has to be layered. The government of Guyana has the responsibility to keeping its citizens secure. That's the first point I want to make. In a democracy, what we do, we surrender our individual rights and put them to collective. So the government has a constitutional duty to ensure that the citizens are safe. Like my individual right to protect myself, I don't have that right. I gave that right up to the state and it's exercised through the police force. For example, my right to judge something, I give it up to the courts. So the viewers have to understand that the government has an abiding duty and bound by those tenets in a modern day democracy to ensure that the citizens are safe. Now, the recent bombing, of course, is, to be put in context, is a major concern to a lot of citizens. I go many places, people ask many questions. We have to connect that bombing to two previous explosions, and I think that's where the security concern is for most of the citizens. I think the government, through its security forces, they need to very quickly establish and tell us whether there's a link between the fatal bombing and the two previous explosions. Not that it's a copycat in my view. Was it a tester? Were they trying and testing the security apparatus, the response mechanism of security forces? Is the fatality deliberate? We have another child who died. Is there a sinister plot greater than a simple explosion, a simple bombing? So I believe the infrastructure in the country is under attack. And if the government doesn't step in very quickly with robust intelligence gathering operations, we could very well find ourselves having more installations being attacked. So yes, I have a serious concern. The government has the duty to ensure it reposes confidence in the people. The police force is at a low in terms of population confidence. The average citizen does not tend to believe what the police says. And here I want to make a very critical point, and I think the police need to listen very carefully. They're making a seminal mistake all the time. The duty of the police force is to protect the citizens from the government and not to protect the government from the citizens. And I think security officers, statutory officers tend to feel that their duty is to protect the government from the people. It is the opposite. The Guyana Police Force and other agencies and statutory officers, they are required to protect the people from the state because the power lies in the state, because we've surrendered that power to the state. As I mentioned earlier, we have surrendered our individual rights and powers to the state. So those persons who hold those offices have to protect us from the state, because the state is the entity that can exercise that power. So the police has to understand that their critical role, perhaps one of the most important agencies in a modern democracy, is the police force. And if the confidence is low in the police force, then it's difficult to detect and solve crime. Because the police cannot solve crime without interacting with the citizens. So the government has to ensure that the confidence in the police is increased significantly by the population. And then it's collaborative agencies like the Guyana Defence Force, which has a constitutional duty to give support to the police force itself, also is organized. The last I checked, the Guyana Defence Force enjoyed one of the highest confidence measures among the agencies in Guyana. Hopefully it's still the same. So it is seen in many cases as the last bastion of democracy, the Defence Force. But the police force is critical. The intelligence gathering agencies are also critical. You talked about domestic intelligence. The sharing of information has always been a difficulty. We need to move to the point where we share information via legislation and not SOPs and not protocols. We need to share information via legislation. The joint intelligence committees, the agencies that operate within the Guyanese sector, they must be forced to share information via legislation, which is mandatory for information, so that when the state of the nation is prepared, when a national intelligence estimate of the country is prepared, which should be done every quarter, we know that the information is coming from an interaction and a synthesis and analysis of information from all the critical agencies in the country, and not monolithically done, not standalone. I think that is something the government needs to work on very quickly. I think if you do that, and the officer, particularly the police force again, hold regular press conferences, interact with the media, interact with the population whom they serve, that will repose some significant confidence in the institution. Like I said, the feeling you get is that the police is there to protect the government from the citizens, and therefore the interaction with the public is very difficult. It's almost as if you have to drag them into the public space for them to speak on a matter that they were appointed for.
Now, Dr. Bess, the government, through the Ministry of Home Affairs, would have said, look, yes, the bomb attack occurred, sadly so, but within 2 days, they were able to apprehend a total of 9 suspects. Do you think that is sufficient to restore that level of confidence? Do you think the announcement that they will be rolling out the ID cards and having migrants enroll on that system sufficient measures to, one, build trust in the systems that exist, and to prevent future attacks?
I would say it's a start, Svetlana. It's a start. Perhaps it's a limpish start, but nonetheless it's a start. I say this because the role of the state is important. The role of the state, the way the state is seen by the citizen, is important. As we say, the fish rots from the head. The entire body politic will respond to the head or the headship. So we have a crisis of confidence. We have a crisis of identity between the citizens and the state. And that is very important. So there's no quick fix. That's why I say it's a start. But let's look at it critically. The EID that the government wishes to introduce and implement, nowhere in reading it does it tell me that it has any effect prior to someone landing at our border. It seems to me if you land at an official border, you'll be captured. But what if you land at a crossing, which is where this gentleman, as I understand it from the media, that's where he arrived. He didn't arrive at a port of entry. He arrived at his own port he created. So what about persons who coming across the borders, coming across, making entries that they create for themselves? Will this e-system be deployed there? No, because that person is evading the regular port of entry. And the extent to which you have people evading the regular port of entry is the extent to which you have to have a system to capture them when they arrive at these ports, these illegal ports of entry. Those areas are well known to the police. So we talk about expanding coverage along our borders, not contracting coverage on our borders. So I do not see the e-system being beneficial to the real threat, which is illegal migrants coming into Guyana or migrants landing illegally. But it will be sufficient to deal with persons who come in through the regular ports, coming legally into the country, therefore you can document them. So it doesn't solve the issue of illegal migrants in Guyana. So it is nice and it is sexy and all of that, but it doesn't solve the problem in my view, because we still have people that will land illegally that will not be captured on that electronic system. So it's a start. That's why I said it's just a start.
Dr. Bess, the Crime Chief, during the press conference they held following the capture of the suspects, pointed out that the prime suspect, along with others, came from Puerto Rico, traveled to regions Ford, the capital city, surveyed the area, and then planted the bomb, and then it exploded. Do you think that the bombing exposed the failure in domestic intelligence gathering and interagency coordination? I know you referenced to this earlier and the need for it to be in legislation form. And if so, do you believe the breakdown is occurring at the level of surveillance, analysis, or political will? And I'm addressing the fact that he was allowed to do all that he did on the 26th of October without being detected.
So I think it's an interconnection of all those factors that you mentioned. From the outside, the rapidity with the police force in apprehending those persons, one can consider that a very positive move. We hope that the real persons have been identified and captured. But his arrival in Guyana at the precise time of 8 a.m., if I recall correctly, can be a bit surprising to the onlooker. And as you mentioned, the person is able to move around Guyana and ex-post factors, we see 2020 vision, then we're recognizing all these challenges. One of the things that stand out, and I think we have to sit back and analyze it carefully, because for everything that happens there is a reason, is why the suspect, as in the police custody, why the suspect did not wear a mask. Why didn't the suspect try to hide his identity? We cannot ignore it, because in other states where there's a lot of terrorism, some of the persons who engage in terrorism unmask themselves to make a statement. By unmasking themselves. So we cannot ignore the fact that this gentleman had no mask and simply say, well, he had no mask. Why? If he is going to be the architect of a fatal bomb attack, and he's the person behind it. So it suggests to me that there is a greater body behind him. And in that case, we cannot now ignore the external factor, that we have a lot of Venezuelans who are illegal in Guyana. They pose a clear and present threat to the country, and there's no doubt in my mind that the president of Venezuela has agents in this country. It is difficult, in fact it is almost unimaginable, that we, within the law enforcement community and Guyanese as a whole, will come to the conclusion that Venezuela is a friendly nation towards Guyana after its president attempts to annex 2/3 of Guyana. We have to see Venezuela not as a friendly force any longer. It's an antagonistic regime in Guyana. Not the Venezuelan people, but the regime itself. And that regime is threatening us. And therefore, from my perspective, we have to ensure that we find all the Venezuelans that are here illegally. And as I mentioned in a piece, I said we needed to put a cap in 2023, bring all the Venezuelans, all of them to central locations, the government and the opposition, its parliamentary committee, bring every one of them there, and then determine who is a legitimate refugee or migrant in the country. Now, the law governing refugees, there are laws that govern refugees. For example, you register in your home country that you as a refugee. So when you arrive in the other country, you can be received, or when you arrive in the country, you can become a refugee. So there are laws that govern refugees. Migrants, Guyana is a migrant nation to a large extent, but nowhere in any international convention does it say or allow a country to overrun another country by its population of refugees. We have to be very cautious about how many persons we can have in Guyana, how many persons our system can feed, our system can manage, our health system can take care of, and we cannot afford to have ourselves overwhelmed by Venezuela. Venezuela is a multi-million population. Brazil is a multi-million population. We can have we call a demographic encirclement, and therefore it puts the Guyana population at risk. I mentioned in the previous article about the Crimea effect. We can have second or third generation Venezuelans speaking Spanish, and you and I may not be here any longer, but we have a referendum. And there is no rule, I would say, and there should be no thinking that says because the Venezuelan is a descendant of a Guyanese, he or she is exempt from being having criminal intent against the country. So we have to be very careful. I know they're legitimate Venezuelans. I have family that went to Venezuela and back in Guyana. They're legitimate, they're family. Right? I had an uncle who went out. So I understand it. But I did call for a cap. I did call for the Venezuelans being looked at. And those who did not fit should have been deported back to Venezuela. If we had done that and sent a strong signal, I think we would have provided the confidence people wanted to see and hear. And we've had in the past structures, we've had systems in the past that we dealt with under previous government, the People's National Congress, many decades ago, in this issue of dealing with the Venezuelans, which was defense in depth, right, and to populate the borders and to populate the villages with reserve forces. We call them militias. We had those before. So all the border towns, we had these militias there. They're there as their first line of defense internally. And the nation's first line of defense was defense diplomacy. And we can talk about the defense in the diplomacy a little later.
Definitely, we'll do that. But you mentioned that you have no doubt that the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, may very well have agents here. Now, the former Minister of Home Affairs, Robson Ben, had said that there were sleeper agents in the country and that Guyana had deported some of them. Now, this administration, the minister of the security heads, the police commissioner, and I think even the crime chief, somewhat are silent on this issue, saying that this, you know what, the statement was made by the former the former Minister of Home Affairs, and they wish not to comment on it. Why do you think that they're so reluctant to address the issues of possible sleeper agents in the country?
It's an easy question and it's a hard question. I think it's hard in the sense that I believe the information gathering is important, but at the same time, there is a reluctance on law enforcement agencies sharing information with the people to whom they serve. And that is a big problem. If you look at how crime is dealt with, oftentimes the commissioners of police or the local commissioner, they feel not necessarily forced, but perhaps forced by media, to really disclose information. No one is asking for information that will impede the investigation. That was a statement made by a former minister. I'm assuming he was informed by information to make that statement. So for me, it still lies as a fact, because we're now seeing, and at least we see unfolded in this last, a fatal bombing involving a Venezuelan and other Venezuelans. So the information probably was there, and the information probably is there, but the government's handling of the information, this is the political construct on the information, is perhaps not to release the information to the Guyanese public. We have open borders. We do not have the force to man the borders completely. If you look at the size of the Guyana border, it's extensive. It's over 1,000 miles. So therefore, we need to have active information. And we have a lot of information carriers. We have miners in the interior. We have people who traverse the interior, who do commerce in the interior. We have the means to capture the information and then at the interagency level, process that information into intelligence. So I'm surprised indeed that after the minister made the statement at the time that there wasn't an aggressive follow-up, a pause for cause to say, let's see what we have in our system, let's see what people have been saying, let's see what advice we were having, and perhaps could have gone to that particular fact of let's bring in all the Venezuelans, let's have them come in, let's process them centrally, let the people see we are processing them. And therefore we identify those who are migrants, economic migrants, and those who are refugees, and those who do not fit the bill. Because if you're young between, I'd say, 21, 18, and 30, I have to look at you very carefully. Because in many of those countries, they have conscription, which means you have military service, mandatory 1 year or 2 year military service. You may be an economic migrant, but we have that service before you. And then you could be led into an activity in the country that is taking care of you against the nation state. So I believe the government dropped the ball big time in this. The government actually exposed the population to what happened, and it is time that they step back, look, and put the people first, and not put politics first, because that's what's on the street. The government is only looking after politics and not looking after the people. The government has a duty and a responsibility to ensure it takes care of its citizens.
Dr. Best, we're witnessing rising street crimes, brazen robberies, gun incidents, and assaults. How much of this, in your assessment, is linked to organized criminal networks versus economic pressures such as poverty and inadequate policing?
It's a combination of both. I hope you don't have the answers to the questions you're asking me. It's a combination of several factors you mentioned. For me, crime is a social phenomenon. And poverty leads to crime. Extreme poverty leads to extreme crime. They're all connected. The challenge we have in Guyana, and if you look at among the population, is really we have crime at all levels in the country. When you speak to the man in the street, he understands and recognizes and feels and sees that only certain types of crimes are being dealt with by the state. We have all types of political crimes, financial crimes, fiscal crimes. And if you talk to the person in the street, that's how they feel. So what's the knock-on effect of that? The knock-on effect of that is the whole structure, societal structure will become weakened. And then you have people reacting in their own ways. So the increase in crime is a reaction to several factors. One, people feel they're being left out of the economy, they're being left out of the wealth in the country. They're seeing the new rich in Guyana, and they're not feeling it. Cash grants are good, but that's not going to solve the problem in the country. A cash grant will come, but that's not going to solve the poverty problem in the country. What we have is inequality, rising inequalities. And until we reduce the inequality, only then we can apply equity. So the government has to find a mechanism to reduce inequalities. And by spending 60 to 70% of the nation's budget on infrastructure, in my humble opinion, is not geared to reducing inequalities. We have to reduce inequalities. We have to support all types of structures, all types of businesses, not only fisher folk, not only rice. There are other persons out there plying their trade who are feeling the squeeze economically. They need support also. And I'm not seeing that coming. I'm not hearing about that. And if you don't deal with it, then you have a section of the economy where crime is high, and then a perception that only certain people are involved in crime. So if you deal with the persons at the top, and we've had lots of reports, lots of allegations of accusations against senior people involved in crime, and absolutely no investigation. That does not sit well with the man in the street. Who is the voter? It doesn't sit well. No investigation. All we hear is that the matter comes up and then it disappears. Or some senior person expresses confidence in the person who's been accused. So the country is going to go nowhere very fast if we don't deal with crime at all levels. And the population is going to react. They do not sit in the same room and decide to react. They react individually, but collectively you see it. So if you look in the street, I said when I came just now, I said I feel like if I'm in the hood, right? And you ask me why. Because downtown, to drive downtown, it's not easy. I don't have a driver. My driver has gone to Exxon. I have to hire another driver. But it's not easy. If you look at the way people drive, the way people walk, the way people react, as if we're on edge all the time. We seem to be a nation on edge because a lot of things are affecting the average Guyanese citizen. The average Guyanese mother has to deal with rising food prices, has to deal with getting her children to school, has to deal with taking care of a home with inadequate financial resources. And then when she looks into the newspaper and she looks around and someone is involved in or accused of some serious crime involving multi-millions of dollars and nothing happens, that depresses her. But her children may react. Her sons may react. Her daughters may react. And then that is seen as a stereotyping a certain type of person or certain types of persons. Poor people will get involved in crime. That is visible. The unpoor does not get involved in crime that is visible. So there's no simple answer to your question. It's a combination of all those factors. But essentially I'm saying Crime is a social phenomenon. It is driven by poverty, it is driven by inequality. And the extent to which inequality continues to rise, which is the case right now in Guyana, it means crime will continue to rise in the country. And the government has a responsibility to reduce it. And I'm not seeing any program really to reduce it. I'm not against cash grants, that's fine, but it's not sustainable. It's not sustainable. We need, beyond that, we need to look at the job the persons are doing and ensure they're properly remunerated. We need to look at the businesses people are involved with and ensure that there's a market for those businesses. We look at agriculture, ensure there's equipment that can be rented and exchanged in the backlands. That's what we need. So you need to empower the people and decentralize governance. So within your local communities, you don't have to depend on central government to take care of your affairs. So all those things together will deal with the issue of crime and a better standard of living for the people in Guyana.
Guyana's borders with Venezuela and Brazil remain largely uncontrolled, and you mentioned that. How much is cross-border human and drug smuggling, illegal firearm trafficking, and criminal infiltration contributing to our internal security? Just now you spoke largely to domestic crime in a sense and the reasons behind that. But how is the border issue fueling internal insecurity?
I would say to a large extent, transnational crime, transborder crime, transnational crime is very evident. The international drug trade is, keep in mind, drug trade is a business, it's just an illegal business. It has structures like regular businesses. The people who are involved in these big businesses, these illegal businesses, they meet and decide on the market and what's the price they're going to sell the illegal items for. Like arms and ammunition that illegally comes into the country that is sold. It's a business, but it's illegal. So we have to recognize, first of all, they have a structure, but it's illegal. And therefore, you have to attack it from the fact that they have a structure. We have to also recognize for transnational crime, that's cross-border crime, that you have persons in high authority that will be involved in these crimes. It's not a simple man. You know, we bust people with marijuana ever so often in the minibus. But you have to go above that. Cocaine is the same thing. You have to go above. It's a network. And there are people who are making millions of dollars at the top. So we have to penetrate. The U.S. likes to say often, when I was involved in the Defense Force, that really and truly our large fish is a small fish to them, is bait for them. But we need to focus on our large fishes. So we have to look at crime, like I said, besides as a social phenomenon, that you have to perhaps to an extent not focus on the guns and bullets so much where crime is concerned, but try to understand what is really a security, what is a security phenomenon. And then once you understand the security phenomenon, then you can go after what are the contents or the constituent elements of that phenomenon. Right? And you can use a mathematical formula to understand what is the security phenomenon. And we find that in the security phenomenon in Guyana is that the extent to which, as I mentioned, there's inequality, rising inequality is the extent to which crime is going to increase. But that's the visible crime. The one that is invisible also increases because the fish rots from the head. And if the head is not strong, the body is going to be very weak. And what we're seeing in Guyana is rising inequality. So you will have networks from cross-border countries connected with networks in Guyana, and they will form their own crime network and bring pressure on the system because the system is weak in terms of law enforcement and in terms of law enforcement response. So to a large extent, there's transborder crime, there's transnational crime. Guyana is a transshipment point for a lot of drugs because it can come in very easily. And one may ask the question, should we spend our resources on ensure we secure our borders? I say yes, we should spend our resources to secure our borders. I would say, what's the benefit of building exceptionally high, large bridges, excellent bridges, roads, and all of that, and then at the same time we can't protect it? So what's the point of building a very expensive house that you can't secure it? So we need to spend resources, and I would like to see in the budgets to come a larger part of the budget going towards national defense. The role of the Guyana Defence Force is really to protect us from external aggression, and the police is internal. And the model we had in the past was defense diplomacy, and the defense component of diplomacy was to ensure that the defense force was equipped to fight for a limited period of time, 48 hours or 72 hours. And during that period of time, the diplomacy is so active that we will get our friends to come in and prevent an aggressor from taking control. We cannot start defending ourselves by not doing anything. For example, if our first call is to an allied force, an American is not going to come and die for us here. No American soldier is going to come and die for Guyanese. It's not going to happen. No. We have to shed that blood if it comes to that point. We will have to shed that blood. And if you look at the Constitution very clearly, which I believe the government is fully aware of, and I wrote on this matter before, but they avoid it, it says it is the duty of every citizen to defend this country. When you're born in Guyana, you're born with that duty embedded in your DNA until the Constitution changes. It is the duty of every citizen to defend Guyana. And from that article was developed every citizen a soldier. That was in the 70s and that was the 80s. It was a national slogan. Whether every citizen believed it or not, that was a national slogan. When you talk about doing things, sloganizing and building your population up to feel that they can defend this country, that's where you go. You don't need to have war tanks and airplanes. You need to have every citizen, every Guyanese, believing that he can defend this country. Therefore, what you put against the enemy, you tell him that he has to kill every single Guyanese if he wants to take this country. When that came out, every citizen a soldier, it was a political slogan from the People's National Congress. It was frowned upon by the then opposition. The PNC was criticized and demonized, who wanted to militarize Guyana. But it kept the Venezuelans at bay. It kept the Venezuelans at bay because they felt that is the entire population they'll have to decimate if they were to take Guyana. So somewhere along the line, they believed they only need to deal with the defense force, perhaps, if they were to get to Guyana. So it has changed. The government has to return and make every citizen, remind every citizen that he or she has a duty to defend Guyana, including the government, of course. And if you do that, you have that national ethos. Yes, executable as ours is good, but do we know or are we certain that the citizens will come and bring their shoulders to defend this nation? The government has to instill that confidence. It is the government's duty and the government's responsibility. So yes, there is trans-border crime. There's a lot of happening on the domestic front. And the other thing that I think I should mention here right now is if we transition into the U.S. presence in the region, if I may.
Yeah.
I think that was your next question, the U.S. presence in the region. Guyana's border problem is not unique, but it is unique. From my perspective, right, as a person who's been looking at this, we're witnessing a new, perhaps not new, but the activation of a theory, an international relations theory, which is called transaction theory. We see the theory of transactions now. That is over there, pushed by the United States current government. So it's transaction. So it's a quid pro quo. I need your rare earth minerals, I will give you A, B, and C. So that's what we're seeing. We're not seeing global leadership anymore from the US as we saw before. We see something looking like global dominance, global transactions. To that extent, the offshore resources we have in Guyana is like gold to the United States. That's the prize. It's not us. It's not you, it's not me. It's not the population. They're interested in the oil we have offshore. Because those giant nations, Canada, United States, China, and Russia, they all need oil to fuel their economy. Then Venezuela, on the other side, has the largest oil reserves in the world. Proven, they said, oil reserves. That's a big catch, too. Chevron is there, the American company is there, but Venezuela has a socialist government, which is the antithesis to democracy according to the Americans. So while we're here dealing with all these issues, and from now and again cash grants, now and again A, B, and C, the real prize is what is offshore. That has to be protected. And that offshore resource was challenged by Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro challenged it and decided he's going to annex and get a governor of Essequibo. And at that time, we did not get the response from CARICOM heads of government that we got recently against the Americans. To some extent, some persons feel quite flabbergasted. But it came down to this point. We have to ensure as a government that we take care of this population. So at some point in time.
So what do we do? Do we support what is happening in the Caribbean Sea? Do we oppose it? Do we remain neutral?
From my perspective, the extent to which there are forces in the Caribbean, U.S. forces, that will be a deterrence to Venezuela's aggression against Guyana, to that extent, yes, we should support it. But conditionally, meaning that what happens within the Caribbean Sea should follow international law, the rules of international law. So I don't believe that we can support the bombing of fishermen or boats. There's something called justice, there's something called due process. People should be arrested. The laws talk about if you're illegal, plying an illegal trade, illegal arms, you're arrested, you're tried, due process, and a court find you guilty or not guilty. So to that extent, I don't think the government of Guyana has even agreed to that. I think we made it very clear as a government that that's not the case. On the other side, when it comes to Guyana being threatened by Venezuela and the American presence, that's one, and two, the Americans bilateral Guyana brings that ease to the government. I see very positive. I see that very positively, but that is not a substitute for Guyana to develop its own defense capability, and that's where my struggle is. Our own defense capability, so that we can operationalize the defense and diplomacy, which I mentioned is that period, like 72 hours where we're there, and we're certain we can hold that ground until, want of a better term, Big Brother comes to help us, a nation comes to help us, or pressures placed on the aggressor and the aggressor backs down. So it's not a substitute to develop. And my suspicion when I look at the last two budgets is that it seems to be a substitute for our defense. It's not a substitute. And that will be recognized by other persons. We still have to spend money in that defense. So the American presence, yes. But Nicolas Maduro, he breached, in my view, the zone of peace. And he was not called out as breaching the zone of peace by the CARICOM ministers in the case of Guyana. And look at what Venezuela did. Over the decades, Venezuela courted CARICOM countries, including Guyana. PetroCaribe in Grenada, Venezuela funds a lot of program in Venezuela for school children. Almost all across the Caribbean, Venezuela had an economic diplomacy to get CARICOM on its side. Because Venezuela's prize is Guyana's to Essequibo. That's Venezuela's interest. Venezuela's interest is not stability, in my view, in the Caribbean. It's to get this country, this 2/3 of this country, which it wrongly believes belong to it. And there are differences between that because Venezuela became independent in the 1800s, long before Guyana. It's a successor government of Spain. Mm-hmm. And in its own mind, it has not disconnected itself from Spain. It's still Iberian in my view, so it sees this portion of this country as theirs. And secondly, there's Board Island that Venezuela is claiming off Antigua. The International Court ruled recently, an advisory opinion, that there's no sustained life on this island, which is a rock, and to that extent, they cannot agree that it's part of a nation state. But Venezuela wanted 200 nautical miles around the EEZ in the Caribbean Sea. So Venezuela, in my view, has imperial ambitions, irrespective of what they say. So CARICOM was found itself in a tough spot. St. Vincent and those countries benefited financially from Venezuela. So found itself in a tough spot when it came to Guyana. Because they worked in it before, they planned it, and they decided if we were going to help them financially, they may not speak out against us. Mm-hmm. So we have to look after ourselves when it comes to our national security. And where we can find international support, I don't see anything wrong with us seeking that international support. Conditionally, I said, in relation to the Americans and the American presence in the Caribbean Sea, is really when it comes to interdiction, persons should be arrested and there should be due process.
Okay. Now, do you believe Guyana is placing too much trust, though, in international diplomacy and the legal proceedings on our border issue and not enough investment? I think you referenced it slightly in deterrence and security capability on the ground, and you mentioned the budgets, but could you elaborate?
Well, the budget is a reflection of how spending would be. So, yes, if you look at the budget and you do a reverse analysis of the budget, you'll recognize that it's not defense diplomacy driven. And I talked before about let's operationalize defense in diplomacy, and the government has not operationalized defense in diplomacy. It is just dealt with defense diplomacy, which is the combination of the two words, and there's an extra or perhaps heavy reliance on international diplomacy vis-a-vis a few nations when it comes to Guyana's sovereignty. I know at the international level, there's quite a lot of positive coming out from the government's position, Guyana's position, I should say, Guyana's position on a number of issues. But we need as many friends as we can get to see this as an injustice against Guyana and to ensure that if Venezuela moves one muscle, that they will be able to stop them, right? Stop them. And brings me to the piece I wrote called The Price of Peace. I was very critical of the Argyle Agreement. Very, very critical of it. And my criticism wasn't well received, but exactly what I thought about Argyle is exactly what happened.
That it was breached. It
would have been breached. It would have been breached. And the only thing the president at the time should have done when he went to Argyle is to tell President Maduro, back off. That's it, back off. Or don't sign any agreement. But sign, and it's being breached. So how could you trust a country like that? How can you trust Venezuela? And mind you, Svetlana, because of what is happening, right? Remember, we have Russian assets in the region now. This is the Russians and Americans fighting what we call a proxy war. They're fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. So the Ukrainians are dying, the Russians are dying. And now there may be a proxy war in this part of the region between the Russians and the Americans again. The silent partner there is China. China owns 20 to 25% of the oil block offshore. China and Exxon are together along with Chevron. China has interest in Venezuela. We talk about commodities and resources to drive the economies of these nations. And Guyanese have to begin to understand that we have the resources they need. And the extent to which they badly need those resources, we can find ourselves either on the positive side or the negative side of this issue. But our people are so stressed and are so distressed at the same time that they have little time to focus on that. And all their energy is about what is going to happen the next day. Am I able to afford food in the market? I'm hearing a few things being talked about, but the government is slowly going right back to how the PNC had managed this country, given the limited resources then, because you have to have programs that serve the people. If you have the youths without jobs, you're going to have challenges. If you have housing communities without playgrounds and parks, you're going to have challenges.
I want to go back a bit to the issue of Venezuela, and I know we've been talking about the U.S. and their presence in the Caribbean Sea, but given the militarization on the Venezuelan side, do you believe that Guyana has the credible defense posture, and what must be done urgently to prevent any miscalculation or aggression in the case of Essequibo?
Well, I think the miscalculation or aggression has been exposed on the part of Venezuela. I don't believe we can miscalculate Guyana because Venezuela is the aggressor. Yeah. Unless the miscalculation is direct towards a nation state that is coming to assist us. And if that is the United States, that's not a miscalculation in a sense. But the miscalculation can be seen from the point of view that if we do not prevent a conflict, there will be serious repercussions in Guyana. If we diplomatically, within Guyana and the Caribbean and the UN, and the United Nations, and the UN Security Council, if we don't prevent a conflict, an actual conflict, then the United States is so far away from Guyana. Russia is very far away from Venezuela. It is likely that Venezuela could lash out at Guyana and Trinidad. And they have sufficient resources to really hit us very hard, and we can have serious, serious repercussions. From that point, from that perspective, that could be a miscalculation. So diplomatically, we have to be very careful, diplomatically. But this has to be wider than Guyana. CARICOM has an important role to play.
CARICOM is divided.
Right.
How do they move forward?
An important role to play, right? So, because it's this transaction theory of transaction I mentioned, I referenced earlier, it is not easy to, in my view, to approach the Americans at the moment because they have this transaction theory they're dealing with. So before we had the theory, realism, which is ultimate power, and I will be your big brother. Now, what are you offering me? What am I going to get from Trinidad? What am I going to get from St. Vincent? What is it you're offering me? That's the transaction theory construct. So we lost there. But Guyana's not lost there, because Guyana has a resource. Mm-hmm. And Guyana could use that resource in a positive way. Guyana should leverage this resource we have within CARICOM. Within CARICOM. Because there was a point in time when Trinidad was very generous again in terms of our situation. They really helped us out with loans and all of that. But we can leverage within CARICOM, so CARICOM is no longer dependent within South America. Could become more dependent within CARICOM itself and within Guyana. We can leverage diplomatically. CARICOM can see itself much better. A lot of CARICOM funding comes from outside of CARICOM because of the amount of money that is available in CARICOM. So if we can spend more in CARICOM, more in projects in CARICOM, more in the commissions that CARICOM has, and we can become more independent. Therefore, we don't have to depend on external financing from other agencies. Our voice become much stronger at the level of the United Nations. So yes, I like the term. I like the probing question of miscalculation. The miscalculation is if there's a conflict that we do not avoid in the region. We unfortunately are going to be the persons who will suffer in this country. So I pray that we keep that in mind. I think the government is very strict on that. I think they understand that. Yes, but more still has to be done, as I mentioned earlier.
I'm going backward. I'm going to, and earlier you spoke about the migration. You spoke about your recommendations for capping, and I would like you to address that. The growing unease among our citizens with respect to the massive migration inflows of Venezuelans. We have Cubans, we have Haitians, we have a lot of migrants here. How does Guyana better balance its humanitarian obligations with the security imperative of proper vetting and registration? And you spoke earlier that the EID card would not be sufficient to really capture those who we want to capture as well in the system.
Those who come in
illegally.
Yes, illegally, because
yeah.
They may not report.
Yes.
Yes. Well, it's an interesting phenomenon that is occurring. As I mentioned it a bit, but I'll talk about it again. The workforce in Guyana, the labor force in Guyana, has become somewhat dependent on Venezuelan labor. Contractors are talking about Venezuelans coming on time to work and producing good work. So politically you'll find them, they say, why don't we keep the Venezuelans?
Producing good work or offering cheap labor?
Cheap labor and, as we understand it, good work. But the fundamental thing is, I said, and I mentioned earlier, there's no convention that says a nation must allow its citizens to be overrun by another population.
Yeah.
You can have a population, and migrant population is greater than your population, but you have to have significant safeguards. For example, in Dubai. In Dubai, those safeguards include one, you don't have the right to vote. That's the first one. So we can have, if the population has to go greater than our national population, for the purpose of developing all the sectors, as we transition to a better country, we have to amend the Constitution. And we have to amend the Constitution and say, yes, you have no right to vote. Your rights to vote can come after second generation or third generation. Because this is a country, in particular for Venezuela, that is challenging Guyana. Every single Venezuelan belief is equal belongs to Guyana, including a Venezuelan that was born of a Guyanese. Because you're Venezuelan, you're born from Guyanese parents. You're taught that in school. Your sympathy is where you are taught. The sympathy for Guyanese children who are born in Venezuela, grew up in Venezuela, is with Venezuela. Right now it's with Guyana, economically speaking. On the flip side of that, the extent to which the Venezuelan crisis is solved is better for Guyana, because a lot of Venezuelans will return to Guyana, I could guarantee you. They will return to Guyana if Venezuela's situation changes. They will go back. We have the smallest, yes, we have the smallest amount of migrants in Venezuela. There are millions in the United States that have left the country. So we have to, again, look at it very carefully. What is in the best interest for Guyana? So we can have constitutional amendments. So yes, you're here, but you're not a threat. You cannot change the market fee by voting. So it takes some time before you could get to this stage. You can have first or second generation rights of voting. So you can have a migrant population, but they have all other rights, right? The right to property, you look at those rights too. How much will you extend to them? The right to property, because you don't want them to come with greater financial resources and they own most of the land, because that is quite possible. There are people in Venezuela with sufficient individual wealth, still, and outside of Venezuela, that can buy up all the land in Guyana. You have to control that. To what extent, how much land they could be owned by an expat. And if you put those things in place, then the population will feel comfortable that, listen, I have the right to vote because I'm on a quote-unquote an original Guyanese. And it will take some time before you get that right to vote. So I don't feel threatened by you. You're not threatening my land allocation because I have the right to land. I have the right to open businesses. The other thing the government can do is to ensure they're joint businesses. So if you come, you could end up in a joint business, so you're not exclusively on your own. If not, we'll have a whole set of Venezuelan enclaves that we can't control. And they'll go to the coast under our laws for their own protection. So those are some of the things we can do.
Politically, do you think the country is there yet, mature, to make those decisions? Constitutional, we've spoken quite a lot in the country about the need for constitutional reform and what needs to be reformed. Do you think we're there yet? And do we think the politicians are willing to take effect the necessary reforms, or do they just allow the system to be so that it works in their favor, whichever side?
To a large extent, yes. I don't believe that the will is there. I think what happened between the major political parties, now we no longer have two, we have three. The major political parties was either of the two hopes to be in power and exercise the same broad powers under the Constitution, so there's limited, there's little interest in changing some major issues. So yes, to that extent I agree with you. You're right there. And political will, I have not seen political will in this government where that is concerned. And then the Constitution itself is an obstruction in many instances to constitutional reform. Because constitutional reform in the Constitution depends on the government, the party in office. It's not a directive to the parliament, meaning that both houses or all the members of parliament. It's the government. So while the government may pass a bill for constitutional reform, it still is timetabled by the government. So in essence, it's sort of ubiquitous, but at the same time, the government can decide to pass legislation or decide not to pass legislation. And if you look at the Constitution, it gives you power and then it takes it back. It says government may pass legislation. And up to now, we haven't had constitutional reform in a 5-year term of a government. So if you really want constitutional reform, it has to be mandatory on the parliament, irrespective of the government. And if the time reaches when it is not done, then by operation of law, it comes into being. You have sectoral committees, and those sectoral committees are supposed to meet. If they don't meet, there's no sanction. So the Constitution, in a sense, obstructs itself. And can a Constitution obstruct itself? I believe yes, it can, based on the provisions. So it has to go beyond the government. The will of the people will have to come into force. And the will of the people is what we need to change Guyana to make it better. The will of the people, the entire population.
The will of the people. Now, finally, Dr. Bess, if you were to advise the government today, what would be the top 3 strategic reforms or investments Guyana must make now to prevent the current security climate from spiraling into a national crisis? And I know we've spoken about a lot, and you could also address the issue of CARICOM and the what's transpiring in the Caribbean Sea as well, as you offer those 3 advice.
I would say that when it comes to the issue of Guyana's borders. I think we still have to push defense diplomacy, but we need to operationalize defense in the diplomacy. That is very weak. On the issue of crime, the government has to reduce inequality. Reduce inequalities in the society, and that will reduce crime. And we cannot apply equity unless we reduce inequality. I think that's the second thing the government will have to do. And thirdly, I think the government needs to trust the population, in the sense that the government must understand that the population, the citizens, require information for their own comfort when it comes to security issues, and that the police force should not be holding back information from the public. And that the police force should be reoriented to understand and to recognize that its duty is to provide information and protection to the people. To the extent I mentioned, is to protect the people from the government and not the government from the people. Because to the average man in the street, that is what is happening. So those are the three things I think. Information concerning criminal activities and defense activities should be shared with the population, so people feel that yes, an excesses by the government is investigated by the police force, so people feel comfortable where that is concerned. Defense diplomacy, operationalize the defense and diplomacy, and the final one is the third one. What did I say?
You spoke about equity
and reducing inequality,
yeah.
Which is a significant humbug when it comes to the development of our people. And we can't be poor in an oil-rich country. I don't want to say oil-rich economy, in an oil-rich country, because my fear, like I said, is that we move to an oil economy and we can have problems. But that's another conversation another time.
Dr. Bess, thank you so much for sitting with me here on Sources. And with that, we've come to the end of this edition of Sources. I've been your host, Svetlana Marshall.
Thank you for having me.